Tashidele Kukamsang, I'm Julika Kamachudran, and today I'm going to talk about how I learned Tibetan, because I get asked so often by people, how did you learn Tibetan? What did you do? How did you learn it? How long did it take you? And things like that. So it all started for me when I was about 16, and I met for the first time a high Tibetan Lama. And with this Tibetan Lama, this was in Europe at the time, there were traveling a lot of Tibetan monks and nuns. And I was really drawn to, the energy, and I was really fascinated by them and something that they were meaning or embodying for me. And I was trying to talk to them. At the time I was 16, so my English was rather poor. I was living in Italy. I didn't have so much English at school. And they were speaking mainly Tibetan and also just a little English. So I decided at that time, because I was so touched and so interested in talking with them and knowing what they would talk about, in daily life. I was so curious. So I decided I'm going to learn Tibetan. That was the first time I decided to do so. But at the time, there were not many books out there. So for some years, I was still in school. I didn't really put that into action. And then I finished school when I was 19. And at that point, and I started my dance school. At the time, I was a dancer. And I came across a Tibetan book where I could learn how to read and write Tibetan with. It was about classical Tibetan, so the language that is used in books and in spiritual texts. So I decided I'm going to study with this first. So I started by myself. I remember sitting in trains or traveling here and there, or sitting in the bus going to dance school, or the metro. I was with this booklet in my pocket all the time, and I would learn how to spell Tibetan, read Tibetan. That was my very beginning. And a few years later, at the time then I was in another school dancing in the Netherlands. At that time, I got an invitation by one monk who said, hey, why don't you come to India, to Bodh Gaya? There's a huge celebration this year. Why don't you come, and I will take care of a hotel for you. I will make sure that you have everything. And I did it. That was my very first trip to India. And I went there just for about 3 weeks. And I could already read some Tibetan at the time. And I went to this very first trip to India, which was, well, very adventurous, but I'm not going to that right now. And when I came back from this trip, I was there for 3 weeks. I went back to my dance school, and everything shifted, everything changed. And I was like, okay, I have to follow this. I have to learn this Tibetan. I was so something India, and being there in Bodh Gaya, which is the place where the Buddha became enlightened, something really happened inside of me, and I decided I have to learn. I have to learn Tibetan now. I have to do it. And in fact, about a year later, I quit my dance school and I went to Asia. And I went to Asia to study Tibetan. And the first place I went to was Nepal. I ended up in Kathmandu. And I was really lucky because before going to Kathmandu, I had met some friends in Buddhist centers who had told me about other friends who had been learning Tibetan. And they told me, hey, contact this person. He knows very good teachers in Kathmandu. And then I already had some contact numbers. And even before traveling to Nepal, I did call all of these teachers that were on my list. And I made appointments with them. So it was wonderful. Even before getting to Nepal, I already had arranged my teachers. I was very, very lucky, I have to say, because I had these two main teachers, and one was for classical Tibetan. So being able to read basically Buddhist texts, because that was my aim. And then the other one was a teacher for colloquial Tibetan, so that I could speak with people, because Tibetan has two main variants, one could say, of the language. So one version is the so-called classical Tibetan, which is very literary. So it is very rich of complex grammatical structures. There are a lot of particles that are being used. The ways how verbs are being used is very different from when you speak, because colloquial Tibetan then is very much oriented in day-to-day language, and in English, in German, in Italian, in all these languages there is a difference between literary language and spoken language. And of course then it also depends on the age or the era that something was written in. So the same goes for Tibetan, and classical Tibetan therefore has a lot more grammar rules that one needs to learn, and also a different vocabulary, because in Buddhist text, there's a lot of, you know, Buddhist vocabulary that you do not necessarily use in day-to-day language. So I had these two main teachers, and I would meet with them daily. I would have lessons with them daily. And we were in a private setting, which means one-to-one lessons, which in Kathmandu in Nepal is a very good place to do that. There are a lot of Tibetan teachers that do individual lessons, and it's also very affordable. So that was fantastic for me. So sometimes with my colloquial teacher, I would meet more often, because classical Tibetan, there needs to be a lot of learning that needs to be done and homework in the meantime. So with him, I would meet with the colloquial teacher every day, sometimes even 2 times a day. And I would even meet on the weekend. Like, I really wanted to make the most of my time. I wasn't interested in much on traveling here and there in that moment, or in, you know, spending my days doing other things, but I really wanted to learn. And so with them I met daily, and then after a little while I met one more or 2 more teachers with whom I would also meet. So with my 2 main teachers from the beginning, I would always do, you know, going through the grammar and practicing the grammar lessons or the colloquial constructions, because there are a lot of constructions that you need to learn, or especially also in colloquial Tibetan. And so these 2 new teachers, I would use them as conversation partners. I would also have individual lessons with them. So then we would just sit one-on-one together and just trying to talk. And whenever I didn't know a word, I would always write it down into my notebook. I had one notebook for classical Tibetan terms and one for colloquial Tibetan terms. And I would always, you know, split the paper into half. On one hand side, I wrote the Tibetan terms, and on the right hand side, I wrote the translation, so that I could, you know, cover it up if I wanted to train my memory. And therefore, with every new word that would come up during the conversation with my colloquial teacher, I would always write them immediately down and ask him, you know, what did you say? We would always stop for everything that I did not understand, and I would write it down. And then during my meals also, like in the evening or lunch or breakfast, I would always have my booklet close to me and like go through the vocab list a little bit like a game. So actually it was pretty fun. It was also hard work, but it was really nice. And another thing that I did that I can really recommend to learn a language, there it was possible, and I think like still today it is, that Tibetan families would rent rooms for foreign students who want to learn the language, so that actually you're living inside of a Tibetan family where you can also learn the language. So I was very lucky to find this family who, it was basically mother, a father, and a child. And all 3 of them were not so good with English, so we would have to use a lot of Tibetan, especially with the child. Also, you know, children then like to talk and only speak their own language. So the child would like tell me all these stories. I wouldn't get much of it, but then I would like ask the parents, what did he say, and take another note in my notebook with the vocab that was already in there, and add on new things. So I did that for about 3 months, every day. I had very little breaks. Also, I wasn't interested in breaks. I had very little of them. And after that time, so that was really my beginning, Tibetan language, the day-to-day speaking was pretty good. I could speak a lot of like day-to-day things. And after these 3 months, then I left Nepal and I went to India at the time. I think the tourist visa for Nepal was only 3 months. So I left and I went to India, where I was studying Tibetan in Delhi for a few months, where I followed some philosophical courses on Buddhist philosophy. So I would try to learn more classical Tibetan at that time and not focus so much on colloquial. And therefore it was quite like 3 months colloquial and then 3 months of classical Tibetan. And of course, you know, it takes a lot of effort to learn Tibetan, because for sure it is not one of the most easy languages. But I feel that the best choice for me was to really immerse myself fully there, so that I could really focus, for one, and 2, be surrounded by people who actually have this as a native language, so that I could always ask, and I would, you know, bother everyone with my questions. I would not hesitate to ask. And then after 3 months in Delhi studying philosophy and more Buddhist vocab, I decided to go to Dharamsala, which is the place where the Dalai Lama lives, where there is one, many exiled Tibetans live. There's a Tibetan settlement, so they call them. And I went to Dharamsala, and I decided to join a school there, which is basically a college. It's called College for Higher Tibetan Studies, in close to Dharamsala, on the village, on the countryside. And there I started joining basically it's equivalent to a bachelor's program that's run by the exile government and from the Tibetans. And it's about Tibetan studies in general. So there you study Tibetan history, you study Tibetan poetry, you study Buddhist philosophy, and you study literature and Tibetan grammar. So it really is about preserving the Tibetan culture. So there were about 300 students, most of them Tibetans, a few foreigners like me. And because I already had learned some colloquial Tibetan and could read, I could join directly with the Tibetans this sort of bachelor program. And that was fantastic because I was the only foreigner in the whole class. And there I was exposed to Tibetan basically, 24/7, once again. And it was a tough time for sure, because everything is so different, and you live in a college, which means you sleep there, you eat there, but you're all the time surrounded by the Tibetans. And they are also very nice people and very friendly people. So it's easy to talk with them. They are always interested in conversations and also in teaching you something. They were really, really so kind to me and so helpful. Because I would start studying Tibetan based on these subjects, which are really also challenging topics. Poetry, for example, is just another style. But I really wanted to get into all these different facets of the Tibetan language so that I could get a collective or more global, let's say, really view and understanding of the language. So I would also want to study history. So I started to learn more and more vocab from different fields of the Tibetan language. And that was definitely very, very enriching and important, because today when I'm translating for a Tibetan Lama or a Khenpo or a Geshe or something, all of these layers can come into the conversation. Sometimes when you talk about the Buddhism or the Dharma, then layers from history can flood in, or layers from poetry can flood in. Tibetans really are people who are full of melody, and the language is very melodious. It has high and low tones. It has aspirated and non-aspirated sounds. And poetry is part of the culture. Music is part of the culture, and metaphors are part of the culture, or idioms. So I wanted to learn idioms as well, and I would basically try to get as much information as I could. I just really felt I had to absorb it all. So there again, I was there. I ended up being there for about 2.5 years. And I didn't finish the whole bachelor program, which was about 4 years, but I stayed for 2.5. And it was a good time, an intense time, and worthwhile. And after these 2.5 years in Dharamsala, I decided to go back to Europe, and I ended up in Vienna. In Vienna, because in Austria, in Vienna, there's a very good university for Tibetology, for Buddhist studies. So I decided that I would deepen my studies there from a more, Western approach. So I joined the university, and I finished graduating with a master's degree in Tibetology and Buddhist studies some years later. And I think that's like pretty much a rough outline of what I did to learn Tibetan. And I think actually the learning never ends. I would always read a lot of Tibetan books, Tibetan texts, and always look up words in the dictionary when I didn't know them. I would listen, for example, when I was back in Europe, to the Tibetan news or the Tibetan radio, where there are a lot of apps where you can listen to them very easily. And I would also listen to the teachings of the Dalai Lama online. So then when he would say some words that I didn't know what they were, I would ask my friends, through WeChat, that Tibetans very much use. It's equivalent to WhatsApp. Or through WhatsApp, I would ask them, hey, what did he say here? I would record and, let them hear it. Or search in the dictionary. So I would, again, learn more vocab. And then, of course, stay in touch with my friends, from time to time, go back to Asia and follow some other philosophy courses, or follow, I did also 6 months as an exchange student later on in Kathmandu, also in another university, deepening my studies again. So, it's a ongoing process, and I think the final piece of learning was really then to be a translator and to become an interpreter for Tibetan. So then, you sort of you try to master what you have learned or to put it into practice. And this is where I'm at today. So today I am using this language for staying in contact with my friends, following teachings, and translating, interpreting for Buddhist Tibetan Lamas. So this is my journey with Tibetan. If you have any questions, write them in the comment section. And yeah, if this video was helpful, also let me know. Thank you very much for watching, and Jaelyong, see you. Yeah.